In a village of La Mancha, in Spain, there once lived one of those gentlemen who usually keep a lance upon a rack, an old target, a lean horse, and a grey hound for cursing. A dish of boiled meat consisting of somewhat more beef than mutton, the fragments served up cold on most nights, lentils on Fridays, bread and pullet on Saturdays, with a small pigeon by way of addition on Sundays, consumed 3/4 of his income. The rest was laid out in a surtout of fine black cloth, a pair of velvet breeches for holidays, with slippers of the same, and on weekdays he prided himself on the very best of his own homespun cloth. His family consisted of a housekeeper somewhat above 40, a niece not quite 20, and a lad for the field and the market, who both saddled the horse and handled the pruning hook. The age of our gentleman bordered upon 50 years. He was of a robust constitution, spare-bodied, of a meagre visage, a very early riser and a keen sportsman. Now, this gentleman, whose name was Alonso Quijana, had so muddled his brains by reading books of chivalry stuffed full of stories of knights and enchanters and the like, that at last he imagined he was bound to turn knight-errant himself, and wander about the world in search of adventures. So to prepare for this, the first thing he did was to scour up a suit of armor, which had been his great-great-grandfather's, and, being mouldy and rust-eaten, had lain by many long years, forgotten in a corner. This he cleaned and furbished up the best he could, but he perceived it had one grand defect, which was, that instead of a helmet there was only a simple morion, or steel cap, a want which he dexterously supplied by contriving a sort of visor of pasteboard, which, being fixed to the headpiece, gave it the appearance of a complete helmet. It is true, indeed, that, to try its strength and whether it was proof against a cut, he drew his sword and, giving it 2 strokes, undid in an instant what he had been a week in doing. But not altogether approving of his having broken it to pieces with so much ease, to secure himself from the like danger for the future, he made it over again, fencing it with small bars of iron within, in such a manner that he rested satisfied of its strength, and without caring to make a fresh experiment on it, he approved and looked upon it as a most excellent helmet. He had a wretched horse, all skin and bone, but to this craziness it seemed the most admirable steed in the world, and after puzzling himself for 4 days to find a name for it, he fixed upon that of Rocinante, as being both expensive and stately. 8 days more puzzling supplied him with a name for himself, that of Don Quixote de La Mancha being the name of his province. His armor being now complete, and his steed, with himself, new named, nothing was wanting but some beautiful damsel of noble birth, for the love of whom he might perform such wondrous deeds as knights errant of old were wont. And a good-looking country girl, who lived hard by, was chosen for this, under the high-sounding title of Dulcinea del Toboso, Toboso being the village where she was born. All being ready, he got up before daybreak one hot July morning, and, without saying a word to anyone, armed himself from head to foot, managed to stick his helmet on his head, and mounted Rocinante, braced on his shield, and, grasping his lance, let himself out of his backyard into the open plain. But he had not gone far when it suddenly occurred to him that before seeking out any adventures he ought to have been dubbed a knight, and also to wear plain white armor without device on the shield, until his own valor had gained him one. It was a terrible difficulty, got over, however, by making up his mind to be dubbed, according to the usage of chivalry, by the first knight whom he met, and to scour his armor on the earliest opportunity until it was white as snow. Then, giving his horse the rein, he jogged along leisurely until nightfall, when, seeing two young women standing at the door of an inn, which his crazed imagination took for a castle, all turrets and battlements, with drawbridge, moat, and everything else that belongs to a stronghold, he drew near, fancying them the ladies of the place. The girls were so frightened at seeing a man armed in that manner with lance and buckler that they ran off into the house. Upon this, Don Quixote, lifting up the pasteboard visor from his dusty, meager face, courteously entreated them not to fly, as it was impossible for a knight to injure anyone, much less ladies of their exalted rank. The girls laughed so at this, and the knight got so angry at their rudeness that the landlord, hearing the fuss, came out, and, with much ado to keep his countenance at the ridiculous figure before him, civilly said, "If your worship is in quest of a lodging, batting a bed, for in this inn there is none to be had, everything else will be found here in great abundance." Don Quixote, perceiving the humility of the governor of the fortress, for such to him appeared the innkeeper and the inn, answered, "Anything will serve me, Señor Castellano, for arms are my ornaments, and fighting my repose." The host thought he called him Castellano because he took him for an honest Castilian, and therefore replied, "If it be so, your worship's beds are hard rocks, and your sleep the being always awake. And since it is so, you may venture to alight, being sure of finding in this poor hut sufficient cause for not sleeping a whole 12-month, which much more one single night." So saying, he went and held Don Quixote's stirrup, who alighted with much difficulty and pains, for he had not broken his fast all that day. He presently requested of the host to take special care of his steed, for he was the best piece of horse flesh that ever ate bread in the world. The innkeeper did not think him half so good as Don Quixote represented him to be, but, putting him up in the stable, returned to see what his guests would be pleased to order, whom the damsels were unarming, for they were already reconciled to him, and though they had taken off the back and breast pieces, they could not find out how to unlace his gorget, or take off the counterfeit beaver, which he had fastened in such a manner with green ribbons, that, there being no possibility of untying them, they must of necessity be cut, which he would by no means consent to, so he remained all that night with his helmet on, the strangest and most ridiculous figure imaginable. Whilst the girls were taking off his armor, imagining them to be persons of the first quality and ladies of that castle, he said to them, with great gaiety, "Never sure was knight so nobly served by ladies as was Don Quixote. After his departure from his village, damsels waited on his person and princesses on his steed. Oh, Rocinante, for that dear ladies is my horse's name, and Don Quixote de la Mancha is my own. For though I was not willing to discover myself, until the exploits done for your service and benefit should discover me, the time will come when your ladyships may command, and I obey, and the valor of my arm shall manifest the desire I have to serve you." The girls, who were not accustomed to such flourishes, answered not a word, but only asked whether he would be pleased to eat anything. "With all my heart," answered Don Quixote. "Anything eatable would, I apprehend, come very seasonably." That day happened to be Friday, and there was nothing to be had in the inn excepting some miserable little dried trouts which they offered him, saying they had nothing better. "So there be many troutlings," answered Don Quixote. "They may serve me instead of one trout. But be that as it will, let it come quickly, for the toil and weight of arms cannot be supported without abundant food." They laid the cloth at the door of the inn for the sake of the fresh breeze, and the landlord brought him some of the ill-dried and worse-cooked fish, with a loaf of bread as black and mouldy as his armor. But it was matter of great laughter to see him eat, for, having his helmet on, and the beaver up, he could not put anything into his mouth with his own hands, but somebody must do it for him. And so one of the aforesaid ladies performed this office. To give him drink, however, would have been utterly impossible if the host had not bored a reed and, putting one end into his mouth, poured in the wine leisurely at the other, all which he suffered patiently, rather than cut the lacings of his helmet. In the meantime, there came to the inn a cow doctor, who, as soon as he arrived, sounded his whistle of reeds 4 or 5 times, which entirely confirmed Don Quixote in the thought that he was in some famous castle, that they served him with music, and that the poor jack was Strauss, the coarse loaf, the finest white bread, the girls ladies, and the host governor of the castle. And so he concluded his resolution to be well taken, and his sally attended with success. But what gave him the most disturbance was that he was not yet dubbed a knight, thinking he could not lawfully undertake any adventure until he had first received the order of knighthood. So, finishing his supper in haste, he called the landlord, and, shutting himself up with him in the stable, fell upon his knees before him and said, "I will never rise from this place, valorous knight, until your courtesy vouchsaves me a boon I mean to beg of you, which will redound to your honor and to the benefit of humankind." The host stared at him, and not knowing what to do or say, strove to raise him from the ground, but in vain, until he had promised to grant him the boon he requested. "I expected no less, sir, from your great magnificence," answered Don Quixote, "and therefore know the boon I would request, and has been vouchsafed me by your liberality, is that you shall tomorrow morning dub me a knight. This night is the chapel of your castle. This night in the chapel of your castle I will watch my armor, and tomorrow, as I have said, what I so earnestly desire shall be accomplished, that I may be duly qualified to wander through the 4 quarters of the world in quest of adventures for the relief of the distressed, and that I may be duly qualified to wander through the 4 quarters of the world in quest of adventures for the relief of the distressed, as is the duty of chivalry and of knights errant."